The Great Turkey Walk, Chapter 13. That Smoky Hill fork went into a series of watery twists and bends that kept us busy for nearly a week till it unraveled itself some. By the time we got to the straight part, we was in true wilderness country, with the trail mostly disappeared. It was nothing but mile after mile of hot sun baking us, baking the tall grass that flowed like an ocean under the prairie winds. Not that I knew what an ocean looked like, but Mr. Peace claimed he'd been born near one. Yep. Spent my baby days by the Atlantic, he remarked late one afternoon as I walked alongside the wagon, just about ready to call it a day. Waves would flow in and out in patterns, like to this here grass. It was in the south of New Jersey. Once you got past the oceans and the marshes, the land was flat too. A lot like this, but you couldn't see forever the way you can here. Forever? Never thought about it that a ways. I squinted past the westering sun. That's when I spotted the little humpy rise just ahead. Something growing out of the prairie sod. Also noticed some dark storm clouds forming dead ahead. Think we'll get any rain tonight? Bidwell Peace swiped at his brow. It'd be due. Long overdue. But the air don't have a rainy sort of feel to it. I swiped at my own face, though I didn't need to. Things was so bone dry, the sweat had been all leached out of me. I was being tanned stiff as leather. I turned back to my birds, and we closed in on the quarter mile to that odd rise. Would have moved right on beyond it if it hadn't turned into a soddy, one of them little dugout houses built halfway into the earth from squares of sod turf. Might have still moved beyond, thinking it deserted, if a wild figure hadn't have come bolting out of it, screeching like a banshee. Thin arms was flailing, legs churning, skirts blowing in the wind. Skirts? Could this raging thing be a woman? I stopped cold. "Mercy!" she cried. "Have mercy on me! Save me from this God-forsaken place!" All the rest of us stopped too, including the birds, on account of she'd flung herself down smack in front of the wagon. Mr. Peace couldn't do other than haul up real hard on Sparky and the other mules. Whoa now. He stared at her as she lay mere inches from the heaving animal's hooves. I loped up front and stared with him. The poor creature was a sight, with her long hair undone, askew, her skirts in shreds, and prairie dust coating every inch of her. "Ma'am?" I reached down to raise her up, but she only sprawled near lifeless in my arms. I looked closer. She weren't actually a man, more of a miss. Underneath the gray dust, the sunken cheeks, was a young lady. "Miss?" Her limp figure jerked, her eyes opening and closing in spasms. "Save me," she whispered. "Save me from this desolation of body and soul." I glanced up to Mr. Peace. He was shaking his head sorrowfully. Prairie madness. I heard tell of it, from being out here with nothing but the wind to listen to. Probably a touch of the ague, besides, from the looks of her. I stood there, sheltering the poor little thing in my arms. What'll I do with her? Mr. Peace creaked off the wagon seat. I guess we've made most of our miles for the day, though I was hoping to get closer to the next bend of the fork, shallow though it be. Seemed to have lost sight of the water for the moment. He studied me and my burden again. Try taking her into the house. Ought to be a bed you can set her on. I looked back at him frightened. You want me to tend to her all by myself? You're a big fellow, Simon. Ought to be able to handle the job. It ain't like she got the energy to bite you. He cracked a smile. Somebody's got to see to the animals and get supper going. Jabeth turned up about then. We stopping? Got nothing but one scrawny rabbit. Those soldiers was lying about only having done in all the game in 50 miles. He noticed the girl at last. His mouth gaped open. What you got there, Simon? What does it look like? I felt suddenly foolish, planted in the middle of the overgrown trail with my drooping burden. Why don't you give Mr. Peace a hand ungearing the mule so he can start up a little rabbit broth for this here young lady? Jabez's jaw clicked shut and then opened again. Sure thing, Simon, but what about water for the birds? They's looking thirstier than usual, and a shrill screech from the bundle in my arms near blasted out my earlobes, my eardrums. The wrath of God is upon us. The trembling arm was pointing toward the sky. My head bobbed up. Sure enough, that black storm cloud was closing in on us. Ain't nothing but some rain coming, miss. Seems to me you could use a little rain. No, she wailed. They wouldn't let me go. Held on to me, every one of them, pulled at me from the very earth. I shook my head at Mr. Peace. He nodded knowingly. She kept on ranting. The Lord said to let his people go, but they wouldn't. I'm one of his people. I am. Tell me I am. Sure and certain, I tried, but she wasn't listening. He gave a warning. I will bring the locusts into thy coast, and they shall cover the face of the earth, that one cannot be able to see the earth. And they shall fill thy houses, and the houses of all thy servants, and the houses of all the Egyptians. Egyptians? My eyes shot back to Mr. Peace. I don't rightly understand. She's quoting from the book of Exodus, Jabeth broke in, from the Bible. I knows that piece fine on account of it were all about escaping from bondage. The plague of locusts that comes after the hail didn't work, and just after the destruction of every single firstborn child. Another screech broke Jabeth's recitation. We all followed the crazy girl's shaken hand as her fingers pointed yet again. Maybe she ain't so crazy, I allowed after I'd seen what she was seeing. Those there storm clouds ain't made of water, no matter how you look at it. Water clouds never buzz. They's made up of grasshoppers. It was Jabez screeching now, beginning to slap all over his body like he'd gone insane too. In a split second, I dropped my burden and was slapping myself. That cloud had fallen all over us, and it was filled with grasshoppers. Hundreds, thousands, millions of them, landing on everything in sight, and their jaws was grinding, ready to chew anything they could find, anything at all. The mules let out tortured braids. I tried to keep my eyes open long enough to check my birds. Was this to be the end of them? The end of us all? Son of a gun! Had to clap my hand over my mouth after I'd let that out. Nearly got a mouthful of the biggest, ugliest bugs I'd ever laid eyes on. But a chuckle almost forced my mouth open again. My turkeys wasn't being attacked. Far from it. They was snapping at those insects as if they'd never seen anything as delectable in their entire lives. Right and left they went at 'em, pecking, swallowing, pecking again. They'd never get their fill. I picked up the girl once more and hauled her into the center of the flock. Mr. Peace and Jabeth caught on and followed. We just set ourselves down there, covered our heads, and waited for my turkeys to save the day. It was twilight by the time the steady droning of grinding grasshopper jaws stopped. It was the stillness, the awesome sudden silence that made me pull away my shielding arms and open my eyes. Somehow that young lady had ended up with her head in my lap. I'd been protecting her the entire time, sort of half aware of the situation, while the plaguey hordes was surrounding us. I let out a whistle, and Jabeth and Mr. Peace came out of their cocoons, too. Even Emmett lifted the front paws he'd flung over his eyes. I'll be, Mr. Peace started. Look at them birds. Jabeth's voice was filled with wonder. I knew all along, every minute, there was a good reason to love turkeys. I felt like a proud papa as I surveyed my bloated flock. They were wobbling around worse than when we pulled off the water drinking contest. Only this time it was almost 1,000 nearly bursting birds stumbling around blissfully. If turkeys could belch, we would have been blown straight back into Missouri, wagon and all. I hunted for the grasshoppers. All that was left in sight was neat little piles of thin black legs. Must be the least tasty part of a hopper. Don't think the birds will be needing the river tonight, I commented unnecessarily as we all watched them begin scratching together sleeping nests in the dry grass. Wouldn't be room in them for the water. Mr. Peace struggled to his feet. Still need to get some water into the mules and horses, but it's getting dark fast. I felt emotion in my lap. Looking down, I remembered the girl and watched as her eyes fluttered open. The well, she whispered. Water in the well behind the house. Not enough for the lost corn. Enough for you. Mr. Peace stared down at her. Looks like this is where I get to use that copper wash tub again. Should suit our four-legged friends just fine as a watering trough. The girl's lids drooped shut again. I collected her in my arms and finally headed into that house of hers. Once inside, I wished I hadn't. First off, I had to hunch down almost in half to squint through the darkness. She had some kind of a dim, earthly-smelling fire burning off in the corner. Aside from that, the only other things in the tiny room was a cobbled-together table and bench and one squat bed. I set her atop the bed, gently pulled up a quilt against the growing cool of the night, and scuttled from the gloom. Mr. Peace was standing out back. Find the well? Not yet, Simon. Found something else, though. He motioned toward a row of low mounds with little stick crosses spiking out of them. I moved closer and frowned at the writing into the wood. There was barely enough light to work it all out. Father, one said. Mother, read another. Then there was the little ones. Brother Tom, Brother John, Sister Sarah, baby Ada. I scratched my head. Seems like more than a plague of locusts came through this place. Seems like the poor thing got a reason for her prairie madness. Mr. Peace raised an arm around my shoulder. It do seem that way, son. But I don't know. It do seem that way. 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 It We stood there for a while until we noticed the mules complaining out front. Mr. Peace let his arm drop. Guess I better find that well. I turned from the graves. Guess I better see about that young lady. Maybe put the cook pot into the little fire she's got inside. I sat next to her bed all night. Couldn't sleep. I propped myself against the wall with my blanket around my shoulders, listening to the wind tearing around the sod house, listening to mice and other creatures scrambling across the dirt floor and up the dirt walls, breathing in the darkness, the dankness that held on to the place despite the hard drought outside, hearing the soft, steady breathing of the little thing that swallowed the rabbit broth we fed her, then collapse again as if she hadn't slept for a year. I never could have rested here, anyways, surrounded by the wind and the ghosts of the graves outside. I wondered how her entire family had been done in, wondered why they'd come to this place of desolation to begin with, wondered how we could leave her in the morning. I finally rubbed my eyes as the first dim shafts of dawn broke through the cracks in the sod. That's when I knew we couldn't do it, couldn't leave her here. I felt better then and turned to touch her arm. You stayed with me all night? I stared at her, whisper. You're awake? Yes, for a long time, thank you. You saved me. One more day would have been the end. I knew it. If the Lord hadn't taken me, I'd have taken myself. It made me shiver to hear her talk, such talk. Hush, ain't no way to speak, no way to be thinking. I needed to get away from that subject. What's your name? Lizzie. Elizabeth Hardwick. Last of the family, last of the Hardwicks. Every one of them. I put a finger on her lips. Be still now, I know. I'm Simon Green. You can come with us. Come with me. Far as you need to go. You're the biggest angel I ever imagined. Her eyes drifted closed again. Coming out of the wind, slaying the plague of locusts, so huge and strong. I bumbled at her words and struck my head on the low roof of the dugout. Hard. I rubbed where it hurt. Me? An angel? That was a good one. I stumbled from the dark, dank room into the fresh, clean morning air. Mr. Peace was already up, watering the mules again. I think we got us another mouth to feed, Mr. Peace. He gave Snowball a loving stroke. Figured as much. Get the coffee working, Simon. On the fire I got going out here. I felt like giving that little man a hug. I gave it to one of the mules instead. Right away, Mr. Peace. Right away.